Hello, welcome. So this is the first lecture after the art historical lecture for Unit 5. This is our survey of painting, and actually painting will be discussed twice in two different units. This unit discussing about painting, we'll talk about most of the older mediums of painting, the ones that were known in the ancient world and the ones that were known up through to the Renaissance, but not including the most modern painting methods, including oil painting and acrylic, which we'll talk about in the next lecture. And so, and in this lecture, I do want to cover some basics. In all paint, the basic structure, what makes one paint different from another, is usually what the binder is, right? In paint, you have the pigment, that's the powder that is the source of the color, such as titanium dioxide, which is a good pigment for white, or a traditional pigment like ferrous oxide, which is just rust, which is a very common pigment for red. So, and then that's mixed with a binder, and that some different ways of mixing it with the binder, and the binder is the thing that holds the paint to the surface. There might also be something called a solvent that can be used to thin down the paint, and then there's something that you paint on, and that's usually referred to as the mount. That could be like a stretched canvas or a piece of paper or a wood panel. Okay, let's start. So the very first medium of painting that we're going to talk about is fresco. And fresco is painting into wet plaster, as it says up at the top of the header. And the way it works is in fresco, you have to work in sections because the plaster has to be exactly the right kind of dampness in order to lay the paint in. The paint is suspended in water. It's not actually a water-based paint. It's more like a suspension. So the pigment is suspended in the water, and the plaster's been put down, and it's almost dry but still damp, and then that's when the colors are laid down. And one of the things about fresco is that because you're painting into wet plaster, the plaster itself becomes the binder, and so the pigment soaks all the way into the wall, sometimes inches deep, and this means that it can be a very permanent form of painting where because the paint stays in the wall, it actually becomes part of the wall. But especially older frescoes, you can really see how the having to paint it in sections also increases sometimes some of the awkwardness of certain decisions, but how you have to organize things. It works really well in like these areas where the artist, in this case Giotto, could paint each figure individually as a section. But then in other areas where you had to get across this whole sky area, it got a little bit more awkward. Here's another very famous example of fresco painting. We'll talk about the Sistine Chapel some more. Obviously, we've already talked about it a little bit as we were discussing the Renaissance. The next oldest form of painting that we know from the ancient world is encaustic, and that's painting where the medium is melted wax. So you have to have some sort of device for heating your paint and your medium to a boiling point. The wax gets very hot, then the pigment is added and it is stirred up, and then it's placed down in layers. Some of the finest and best examples of, especially from the ancient world, are these Egyptian Fayum portraits. When Egypt became a mostly Hellenistic Greek style society, they still kept the idea of sarcophagi and kind of an Egyptian type funeral, but they shifted some of their practices, and one of the things that changed was that instead of the sarcophagus having a sculpted head of the person, they would have these painted portraits. And it became very common, especially to do this for when a young man died at an early age. And so we see all three of these paintings here, portraits of one boy and of two young men who died young. And these paintings from from Egypt are some of the most beautiful paintings ever. But encaustic is not only used in the ancient world, it's still, just like Fresco is still used today in some places, and there have been some 20th century artists who have done quite amazing things with encaustic. Most notably Jasper Johns did almost all of his most famous paintings from the 50s and 60s were done in encaustic. But also James Ensor, who we'll talk about later as an artist, not known for his encaustic paintings, but did experiment a bit with encaustics. Here's another Jasper Johns. This is 3 different panel paintings stacked on top of each other. 3 Flags is probably his most famous painting of all time. And you can see how by painting the American flag in encaustic, because of the nature of encaustic, it's very textural, it's very built up, it kind of transforms the flag in some ways, makes it both very familiar and yet very unfamiliar. And so the last one that we're going to be talking about today is tempera painting. And I'm going to talk a little bit about tempera painting now, but then probably take a break and come back to the second part of this lecture so I can talk about the transition of tempera painting to oil painting. The main thing I want to say right now is that tempera painting is, like the other paintings, it's all about what is the binder. In this case, the binder is egg yolk, not egg white, which seems strange to a lot of people because you would think the yolk has a lot of color to it. But it's the egg yolk, and there are certain properties about egg yolk that are really interesting. If you've ever had eggs for breakfast and then left your plate unwashed, you'll notice that it dries to a really, really hard shell, and it's quite hard to wash off if you let it completely dry. But the other thing that's interesting about egg as a binder is that the lipids in egg bond both with oils and with water. So it's one of the few mediums that can actually be where the solvent or the medium can be either oil-based or water-based. Okay, I'm going to end it right here. And then in the next half, I'll finish talking about